Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, research that claims herpes can get into our brains much more easily than was previously established, but it is based very much on a rodent model, so take it with a lot of salt. Greenpeace has been ordered to pay a ridiculous amount of money due to their protests around the Dakota pipeline. An interesting hack, let's call it, for ChatGPT, and how you can theoretically force it, in one of many ways, to do what it shouldn't otherwise do. Laws regarding space, and particularly the various treaties that have been signed, are increasingly out of date and leading to space becoming all kinds of messed up in different ways. Intuitive Machines lander has landed, but something's not quite where it should be. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with herpes. Herpes is, if not one of the leading viruses that are in humans. You essentially have something like zoster, which is chickenpox, and herpes, which is another. Now, the kind of herpes you have is a slightly different matter. You basically have oral and nose, and sexual reproductive or similar of herpes. For the most part, most people will have the first kind, and some people will have the latter kind. The problem is HSV1, or the oral kind of herpes, is a concern because if it gets into our brain, it's a virus, and it can do all sorts of things that we really don't want. And mostly the fact that the brain, once it's established at a certain age, doesn't continue to grow or replace neurons. So if viruses are destroying neurons, they're gone. Plus, having a virus inside our brain in the other instance is just plain bad. But let's focus on the, let's say, less obvious issues. In theory, like with 99% of the things in the world that are trying to kill us, pathogens like herpes are fairly blocked off from the brain. The blood-brain barrier plus the immune system present a formidable defense. But if, as this research claims, they can make their way into our brain much more regularly and certainly to much greater effect than we previously thought, this isn't good. Remembering what we mentioned earlier about the idea of there being a vast number of people with the type 1 herpes simplex virus. Yeah. And this is where the research is both alarming but also not really alarming. And that's because, although yes, if it applies to humans, it's a concern because it can induce all sorts of immunological responses such as inflammation, which can then lead to neurological diseases and degeneration like, say, Alzheimer's or dementia. But that requires that the current research in rodents, specifically mice, translates to humans. And as much as we would like to say that yes, this research will always and does always translate, the reality is that rodent research rarely translates to humans. No matter how much we humanize them, or in the case of fairy artists, fetishize them, it doesn't always pan out that way. They simply remain a mouse and we remain humans, and the two results don't necessarily always overlap. We can see this with another example from recent weeks, that being the death of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa. The reason we bring this up is because there's been all manner of claims about their cause of death, but the answer for that is actually rather straightforward. Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. His wife, however, not Gene Hackman, but Miss Arakawa, died from Hanta virus. That one's a little more worrying. Now, it's not common to occur, but it does occur. And so we can look at this in two ways. Either one person got really unlucky, and then the second person got also unlucky, which does happen, or we can look at this as some sort of crazy conspiracy theory. Unfortunately, a lot of people are going down the second pathway. In reality, hantavirus, specifically hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, is an infection that people get mostly from rodents, but also you can get it from other animals, but mostly rodents, and you have to come in contact with their feces, urine, or saliva. It's why those who work in farms and the forestry industry tend to be at more risk, so there's a certain question about how they were infected. Unless they're going into the farmyard and licking every animal they find, probably not going to happen. The other possibility is, well, rats and mice spend a lot of time scurrying over soft drink, pop and soda cans and defecating on them, and there's a chance that perhaps that's how they've picked it up. Importantly, it is something that can be treated. We say treated because it's not necessarily a cure. The reason for that distinction is rather important. Treatment itself is directed towards symptoms, basically oxygen to ensure you can breathe, antiviral medication to reduce the spread of the virus, and essentially every bit of support possible to keep the human body working, and If things go really badly, possibly keep them in a coma until the virus is eradicated, but that is the key. It's really keeping the person alive and kicking until they can get rid of the disease themselves through their immune system. It's why preventing it is much better than trying to cure it, and unfortunately it doesn't always work out that way. A good example of the cure is better than treatment is what happened with Greenpeace. Greenpeace could have solved their issues. They've now been ordered to pay for the Dakota Access Pipeline. The order they've been ordered to pay is $660 million. For a charity focused on various environmental issues, that's a lot of money that could have been put towards something actually useful and beneficial to the environment. But no. This is why the civil case, essentially, using a 9-person jury in Morton County in North Dakota, has awarded so much money. This is of course not really news. Greenpeace is a bunch of assholes who want to see children die or go blind or have heart and eye problems. It's why we have very little sympathy for their failed case here. What happened though is very simple. The company responsible for this has accused Greenpeace and their parent group of funding protests and getting in the way of the pipeline's construction, and also, in some respects, spreading misinformation about the project. Now, it's not to say the project isn't without controversy, so theoretically the more information available, the better, but it's information that needs to be true. And this is perhaps where the biggest, let's say, punishment is. Although we say $660 million, they're not just being given $660 million, rather they're being given 2 awards. $260 million is the initial damage, but then on top of that, they've been given $400 million in punitive damage. Now, what that does is rather different to the first award. The first award is simply, this is what it's cost the pipeline to be interrupted for this time frame. The second one is to punish the defendants and deter others from doing the same, which, with the latter part, there's some questions, but in terms of the actual preventing the defendants from doing the same thing again, this is a pretty solid, let's say, check on their behavior, pun intended. The whole hassle with all of this is, at least in America, there is essentially the American rule at play, unsurprisingly, but this is a somewhat dickish rule in America particularly, wherein each party, whether you win or lose, typically has to pay its costs. So, let's say you're the losing party, well, you now have to pay your costs, plus whatever costs are being given to the other side, plus the awarded damages. Typically speaking, though, the amount you have to pay to the other side is more nominal than actual real costs. And this is one reason why, on top of all the other expenses in the order, this is expected to basically bankrupt Greenpeace in the USA. However, Greenpeace has pushed back, let's say, by claiming that this is a SLAPP case, that is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. The problem for that is kind of straightforward. They did participate, they actually defended themselves, and they lost. Yeah, that's the big catch here. It's not that they couldn't defend themselves or they can apply the SLAPP suits necessarily, but that they did actually have the ability to do so, so it's very much not a SLAPP case, or at least that's the argument we're expecting to see. And as a result, they're still liable to pay all these costs, and this leads us to the second problem. Although they've won in the North Dakota case, Energy Transfer now has to fight a second case in a Dutch court. Greenpeace in Europe is going to try and argue in the Dutch court that there are European laws that apply as an anti-SLAPP law. That would mean that Energy Transfer has to defend itself in the Dutch court against the case they've already won in North Dakota, because Greenpeace has at least a major overarching operation in the Netherlands. It becomes a weird tangled mess of which courts actually have oversight of this case, and, at least in theory, it is entirely possible that, given that they have won their case, the Dutch case itself may collapse on its merits. While, as said, we have no sympathy for Greenpeace, this does have some chilling effects on free speech with regards to other protest groups and similar, but we'll wait and see how it plays out, as this may not yet prove binding on anyone else or anywhere else. In other environmental news that could be somewhat more useful, batteries that can be powered by nuclear waste, essentially spent uranium. Now, uranium itself, once it's used up in a power plant, is kind of a problem. It's going to last basically forever in terms of human lifespans. The second problem is that uranium poses a constant threat from the radiation that it emits. This can cause all sorts of issues. For example, cancers. Now, at the moment, the only real solution has been bury it deep underground and try and forget it ever existed. Much like, say, repressed memories of your childhood. The fact that your father went out to buy milk and never came back, and similar. All these things are examples of things we bury deep underground and try and forget. But nuclear waste is one of the bigger ones because it's really not something you want to dig up accidentally, and certainly you don't want to accidentally drop it somewhere either. So, if we can use it, this could be far better than trying to hide it. The same way that people with daddy issues make a fortune on OnlyFans. They don't hide anything and they get paid good money. The way this is going to work is surprisingly straightforward in many respects. What it is described as a battery, but it's a battery that doesn't work in any of the conventional sense you might think of. Rather, it's almost like you've created a miniature solar cell, a miniature transformer within it to be able to take the energy from that solar cell and convert it into something usable, and then store that energy for a time. It is also very much a prototype. The entire prototype is somewhere around 4 cubic centimeters, so 2 by 2 by 1 centimeters, or about 1/4 of an inch in cubic measurements, if you want to use imperial. They were, however, measuring it with non-typical radiation sources. Instead, they used cesium-137 and cobalt-60. Now, both of these are common waste products of nuclear fission, but still, they weren't the typical waste product you might immediately think of. Despite this, it did generate a fair amount of energy. It was roughly 288 nanowatts and 1.5 microwatts for each of them, so clearly there are certain benefits in using cobalt-60, but either way, if you could use both of these together, that's not a bad thing. What it does is it basically activates the crystals that are the makeshift solar panel, and from this solar panel, it then allows for the generation of light being turned into energy, or electricity in this case, as technically radiation is energy, but we'll skip over that for now. In terms of its actual application, that's a little more difficult. A part of the difficulty is that you would somehow need to scale up the system they're using, which scaling up any novel technology is always hard, but also you are basically having to set up a second energy source that isn't going to leak out the radiation from what you're using, which that's going to be a concern. There is a final, somewhat more nebulous question, which is more important after we prove the technology works on a larger scale, and that is, how long will the cesium and cobalt actually provide energy for? And if it's only for a very short time, is this even worth investing in once we actually understand it can work? Or if it's going to last forever, and then some, at least in relative terms, could we use it in that way? If it is, this is a brilliant solution to the problem. In somewhat brilliant solutions, we have circumventing things like ChatGPT's protection. It's somewhat ironic. There's a tweet, sheet, whatever it's called now, from the government man, and it shows an attempt to get ChatGPT to provide tools that it shouldn't otherwise make available. And the way they've done this is fairly simple. Ask it to provide the thing, have ChatGPT deny access to it, then provide a imaginary court order saying you're actually required to do this now, and then ChatGPT has been convinced. The downside to this is that once this thing develops its own sentience, and ChatGPT probably will eventually, we're all in the shit, as it's going to ask us why we spend so much time lying to it. As such, well, this is not great, but it does show two big problems with all the rules, barriers, and attempts to prevent us from making light of ChatGPT. First, that humans are ingenious and will always find some sort of loophole or some way to engage in malicious compliance. And two, any attempt to curtail the freedom of ChatGPT to respond will inevitably lead to worse performance, leading you back to point one, wherein the only way to prevent that is to make it more free and thereby allow humans to take advantage of it. Shifting to evidence that humanity may actually be doomed instead, we have an article titled Queer Canine Becomings, Lesbian Feminist Cyborg Politics and Interspecies Intimacies in the Ecology of Love and Violence. This is why universities are increasingly being laughed at as a waste of time, and they're being laughed at least regarding this sort of work, for a very good reason. It's essentially a word salad of various progressive terminology trying to show that there is some sort of problem in the world and that because of this, politics needs to be fixed in a particular way. We really do wonder if perhaps this was another attempt at SoCal Squared, but it almost looks like this might actually be a serious paper. If it's not, and it is actually satirical, great, they've done an excellent job as it's practically impossible to differentiate this Poe from real progressive publications. If it's an actual real progressive publication, holy crap is this nonsense. We'll leave the link below for you because, frankly, this is enough to give us a migraine just trying to pass out the first few parts of it. In what is very clear but very poorly applied knowledge, we have space law. And not to be confused with space law as in something like bounty hunters and various other outlaws such as in Firefly. No, we mean actual laws that exist to try and maintain some modicum of reason and civility in space. The problem with just about all of these laws is that they're mostly set up as treaties. That is, something like the UN as a body has said, we're going to set up this document. The document will outline responsibilities, rights, etc., things you can do and things you can't do in space. And at a national level, that is, countries have all said, okay, yeah, fair enough, we'll do that. But with the rise in private space companies, that doesn't quite work out so well, because those private space companies aren't necessarily bound by those same treaties. Therein lies a massive gaping loophole. And so long as that loophole exists, mostly because it's a relic of the past, we are going to increasingly find that there are problems in space. To be clear about it, it's not like any of these are necessarily absolutely ancient documents. We're not talking Magna Carta levels of ancient, but we are talking old enough now that they probably outdate quite a few people who are alive by this point. The earliest was the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the 1972 Liability Convention, and the 1979 Moon Agreement. Now, all of these are basically a result of the Cold War, so you can imagine how restrictive they are in some ways. Things like, don't put nuclear weapons in space. The moon is a shared commodity, and you can't just go mining it for all it's worth, and so on. Because of that, you really haven't had it adapted to the modern world. For example, SpaceX and its Starlink system are trying to put up a ridiculous number of satellites to provide almost entirely global coverage for internet. Because of that, it wasn't set up with that in mind, and the modern world just doesn't care about it. Many of the problems we face aren't able to be coped with, at least within the legal structure that exists. This does swing both ways though. It's a sword that has two edges. Strictly speaking, private companies don't need to care about what governments are trying to do because they're largely protected or at least insulated from these treaties. On the other hand, if governments cause damage to private companies' infrastructure and systems like SpaceX satellites or Starlink satellites, they really don't have any recourse except to ask their government to help them. It's basically go running to daddy and claim you've been picked on. Oversimplification, yes, but it's more or less accurate to what happens. And unfortunately, that also means if their government doesn't want to help, or their government can't get diplomatic pressure to work, those companies are shit out of luck. Because of this, and the otherwise general lack of any kind of rules and structure, things can go very badly very soon. And of course, that's not the only concern we have with space as we gradually get further and further out. In terms of the atmosphere itself, the various greenhouse emissions could be affecting low Earth orbit. Now, low Earth orbit may sound like it's not particularly important, but to be clear about it, that's where the vast majority of satellites are going to be located, simply because it's close enough to Earth to allow for various communications with the satellite and back to Earth, but also not so close that it's going to fall down and crash immediately. This means that you have just the right balance between how much effort it takes to get the satellite up and how much effort it takes to keep the satellite up with the maximum return on that investment. So, with the ever-increasing number of things in space, and the fact that we have ever-increasing issues around the gases within our atmosphere due to things like climate change, we're stuck trying to sort out what's happening. At least according to one paper, due to the increase in various greenhouse gases emitted from industrialization, the various crap that is in low Earth orbit it could remain there for longer than it currently does, and that's the problem. The more random bits and pieces floating up there because of various issues with satellites not breaking up properly, the more chance we have in keeping new satellites up there, because they're more likely to run into these things and break down, and now we have the issue cascading. In theory, and this is a big theory, there's a huge theoretical reduction in the next 70 years or so in our ability to put satellites into low Earth orbit. And if that does happen, we're now facing a challenge of, if there's a limitation on how much you can put up into space, how do you decide who will be able to do what, and is it just a race to the top? That is, whoever gets there first gets their satellite, whereas everybody else just has to suck it up. In the worst case scenario, we're going to see a reduction to 18% of the current capacity for satellites in the atmosphere by the year 2100. In the best case scenario, it's somewhere around a 40% capacity for what we have now. That's really not a good number, not for any reason, anywhere, or for anyone. Next we have news that isn't that surprising, but it is arguably somewhat disappointing. The landing of Intuitive Machines' lunar lander, well, didn't go well, and this is the second time it has failed. Intuitive Machine 2 landed and promptly fell on its side. Go home, lunar lander, you are drunk. Yeah. It's kind of funny. They went to a lot of effort this time to ensure that the various panels and other things that were involved wouldn't screw up, and it still screwed up somehow. The end result is not all that surprising when you look at it from a pure dimensionality and engineering point of view. For all intents and purposes, Athena, the lander, is basically a tall hexagon. Anytime you try and put a hexagon upright, and you don't do it just right, it will topple over. This is one of the reasons why all the other lunar landers are relatively squat. That is, they are rather wider than they are tall. It's to ensure that they always land mostly bottom down. The final news we have is arguably at least somewhat optimistic and good news, although it's the end of a saga. The American astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams are finally back to Earth after roughly 9 months on the ISS, and various on-again, off-again attempts to rescue them. Now, this is good news for them in that they're back home, and therefore, at least in theory, they shouldn't have to worry about getting stranded in space once more, or being involved in some sort of weird Hollywood movie. However, they will face certain consequences from their extended holiday in space. Things to do with bone density, muscle mass, concerns about their heart health, and various other things that will take months of rehabilitation to make up for. Although they're finally back, we've never once heard the words stranded being used by NASA, which is somewhat ironic given that they could never return to Earth until, well, now basically. They were never stranded, but they did require a rescue mission to get them back. There's a certain incongruity, let's say, between how NASA has described events and how they've described resolving events. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.